Hey, Juliet, welcome back. Great to chat to you again.
You too, Chrissy Lee. How have you been?
Really, really great. Thank you. I've been working with lots of businesses recently about this very topic we're about to talk about.
Yes, values and behaviours. This is one of my favourite things because I think this is what drives so many teams and organisations.
Absolutely. Yeah, you would do a lot of this work, I imagine, with your clients.
I do, and it's interesting how often it's not really understood. So when we talk about values, I've worked with plenty of large organisations where they've decided their values, they've printed them on lovely posters and they've got them on the wall. And I will literally walk past them, on my way into a meeting room with people and say, so tell me about your values. And I get these blank looks like, I think one of them's innovation, and honestly, people just don't connect with them at all. So this idea that, oh yes, we've got values doesn't always flow through to the behaviours.
No. And just because you've got your values printed on your wall does not mean they mean anything. And I feel like the more I see them planted on your wall, the less likely I am to see them in your people.
I totally agree, yes. And I often get blank looks when I say to people, so have you talked about behaviours with your teams? One of the challenges I've been seeing lately is that people, leaders who are struggling to have conversations about bad behaviour with their people because they've never articulated what behaviour should be in the team.
Yes.
They've just assumed everybody would understand because we've put the poster on the wall that says, we're going to be kind to each other or whatever.
Yeah.
When people aren't, there's not a shared understanding about what these things mean.
Yeah. I see that all the time as well. I think even if the leaders are clear on the values, which often they're not, they're not clear on what that actually means. How does that translate into behaviours? And the businesses that have done a lot of work on this, it really works. I mean, the behaviours that you tolerate and accept and encourage are the behaviours that build your culture. So there is a very direct correlation between people that can articulate their values, articulate how that plays out in terms of workplace behaviour. They have the best cultures.
I talk to my members too about this idea that it's a bit like an iceberg. And the stuff you see, the part of the iceberg that's above the water is all those things like your posters, it's your policies and procedures, it's the stuff you can print out and distribute to people. But it's actually what goes on underneath the water that's the important stuff. It's the traditions that are established and the perceptions people have, the stories they tell, that I think are the most important. And that's the how we do what we do, isn't it?
Yes.
It's all of that stuff. And I know, and I see it so often. I was working in a very structured organisation, government organisation for about 18 months. And we talked about all of this. And we were talking about this idea that they've got all these policies and procedures, but a new person comes in and goes to do something the way the policy or the procedure says. And someone in the team go, oh, yeah, no, it says that. Don't worry about that. We just do it this way. And what we know is that if the person says, oh, no, I think I'll follow the procedure, they just won't belong in the team. The team will go, oh, I don't know about you.
Yeah.
So most people will go, oh, okay, fine. I'll just throw out the procedure. I'll just do whatever you tell me. That's that stuff, isn't it, below the waterline? And if we don't deal with that and really articulate what those behaviours should be, then other people, everybody, the strongest people in the team will drive that culture, won't they?
Oh, 1,000%. That happens all the time. And I think the thing with behaviours is we aren't good at articulating what behaviours are in or out. And we're also really bad at tolerating behaviour that we're not happy with because we don't know how to have those conversations that you were just talking about. And there is that saying that you encourage what you tolerate. So if you're tolerating something, you're encouraging it to continue. And then that's building that culture that you don't want.
And how do you even discuss that if you haven't articulated what you do want? I think that's the process I work through with lots of teams is when you have your values, I mean, you need to decide on your values first. They need to be meaningful to you. You don't want them to be something that you could just take next door to the next business and they can use them.
Which you do see a lot. You see a lot of, honesty, integrity,
Right. And they don't really mean anything to anybody.
No.
But I think once you've got them, to me, the process is about talking with each team about what does that mean. And I make them actually unpick it to the point where, okay, our value here is creativity. In order to demonstrate creativity, I will, you know, or we as a team will. And they have to actually put in verbs. They have to talk about the behaviours that they will demonstrate.
And it makes it so much more relevant and relatable to your employees when you go to that detail, because, you know, if you've got, let's say innovation is one of your values, what does that actually mean for the accounts team? Like, what does innovation look like for them? Because that might be an easy value to relate to your product development team, sure. But what does it mean for everyone at every level in the business? Because that's the only way they'll be able to show up and really, contribute to innovation, is to understand what behaviours innovation actually means for them in their role.
Totally. And I think that's the step that I see so often doesn't happen, is that there's not these conversations. And by having these conversations at a team level, and as you say, teams will be different.
Yeah.
You know, the engineering team and the sales team are going to have often quite different behaviours.
Yes.
Support the same values.
Yes.
And when you have those conversations, people buy in, don't they? Because they get to say, well, I don't think that. That's not how I would interpret it. I would think this or this. And they get to toss it around. And what I see is once they've had those conversations, it's so much easier for people in the team to say to one another, but we agreed that this is how we were going to behave. You're not doing it.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. It gives people some focus as well, you know, other than just going through the motions of their role. They've had this discussion around, we're going to demonstrate the value of innovation. We've said that this is what this is going to look like. I'm going to do that. They take it on as a bit of a challenge. So it pushes them in the right direction as well, rather than just getting the job done. Yes.
Yeah, totally. I think it really does help motivate people.
Yes.
Because they're crystal clear about what's required and what's okay.
And it gives them a sense of purpose back to those values. And everyone wants to feel like they're contributing. It's a kind of a human nature thing. So I think it does tie back. So if we go back to the top and the values, would your opinion be that the values should be set by the business owner or the CEO, the very top of, you know, whoever's in charge of leading the vision of the business?
Yeah.
They should be the one deciding on the values, shouldn't they?
Yes.
This isn't the values are not a team exercise.
No.
It's the next level down. It's the team exercise.
I think the values are part of leadership. I think defining the values, and particularly if it's your business, you really want to shape those. I think if you try to get everybody designing the values, it becomes an exercise that it's never ending. And then it's dissatisfaction about it. And
Yeah, and it also then means you're creating a business that's for your team and not for you. And I do see small business owners especially fall into this trap in an effort to be super inclusive and to try and, you know, get their team involved. So the intention is all right. But what I say to them is, your team can't dictate your values, because they're going to be gone in a couple of years. And what then? You're left with values that you never really were aligned to. So if you're the business owner, you absolutely have to set the values, because there's no other way.
And you're going to lead those values too, aren't you? As the business owner, you're going to lead those.
So you really have to be invested in what they are. And quite often there'll be values that are important to you personally as well. So they've got to be, values that you really are quite passionate about. But then getting the team involved in constructing the behaviours that are in or out. For each value, I think is critical. And I used to do this with my consultancy practice. We used to sort of have a couple of meetings a year, but one big one at the beginning of every year. And we would look at, what are we focusing on? We'd talk about values, and they would really articulate how they're going to show up with those. And we only had a small team. And I remember one of the things we used to do as part of that is I would let everyone choose their position title, because I wanted them to really own it. I did veto a few, but there was some random stuff thrown around. But one year, one of our values was around really looking after our clients. And one of my best consultants was awesome at this, because she loved to be friends with everyone, a super extrovert. And she made her title for the year Client BFF, which was, you know, we like to keep it light. We had quite quirky titles, but it was great, because in terms of looking after clients and that being one of our values, she owned that title like nobody's business. So it really let her own that and show up every day, contributing to that value.
And feeling completely motivated about that.
She loved it.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. I love that.
So I think having those forums, whether it's a strategy day or a planning day, having some forum where you're talking about this and like you said, workshopping it and bouncing it around is really important.
Yeah, totally. I think it is. And I think for these sorts of things, getting in the room is pretty important. And I know that's so hard still for so many teams, but I think getting in the room, make sure everybody's involved in this. And I think that's much harder to do online for this sort of stuff. Yeah,
I totally agree. In fact, I'm seeing a lot of my members doing this at the moment. So one of our members has recently just done a 3-day staff retreat. I can't think of what they called it, but it was 3 days solid, got their whole team together. They all work remotely. So they got them all in the same place. And I can't wait to unpack it with them, but it was super valuable. And just before we jumped onto recording, I've got an email from another member saying I'm planning this off-site staff day, planning day, and wanting some input on that. So I'm seeing more people start to do it. And I think if you can get people physically in a room, it is very valuable for this particular purpose.
Yes, I'm doing one with a client in a couple of weeks and I actually can't wait because I love getting in the room, having these conversations without distractions, and not for an hour or two, but for a couple of days where you're actually really nutting things out. I think it's so important. The other thing I have seen, and I don't know whether you've seen this with your clients, but sometimes when there's been difficult behaviours that haven't been dealt with, what I talk with them about is this sort of idea of a team charter where they have above and below the line behaviours. And so when you're starting to articulate the behaviours that flow from your values, if that's a helpful thing, I think it can be something that's pretty simple to do, because once you've had the conversation about how do we want to behave, you can identify. So above the line behaviours are the ways you want to behave. And then below the line behaviours may be some of the things that have been going on. That you want to put an end to.
And that I've got one client that does that, and they've got their staff call it with each other. They say you're below the line. So they've created this environment where it's safe and encouraged for people to call each other out if they see someone slipping below the line. And I think that's a really simple framework for people to use, because just as important as it is to articulate what behaviours we want from people, it's also really important to articulate what behaviours are not okay.
I think so too. And I think doing this sort of exercise does help team members hold each other accountable. I think that, and that's, people really value that. I think it's so much easier for them to have that conversation that says, I'm helpful, you're being a jerk, whatever, because they've actually articulated what that looks like, what's okay and what's not. So it's a really good tool, I see, for lots of teams. To have those conversations.
And it's important for the team to contribute to that as well, I think, in terms of creating that sense of ownership about the behaviours. And it is really important as well that, once you've articulated all of this and you've got it all clear, that you hold people to it and that you don't let things slide, because then the rest of the team will start to think, well, what's the point of me making all this effort to be all those great behaviours, So you've got to be prepared to then have that difficult conversation or talk to someone and turn them around.
And I think, and again, it makes it easier because you've articulated, we've talked in the past about feedback conversations, but also performance reviews. When we're talking about behaviours, you've got something really concrete to look at, haven't you?
Absolutely.
To say, you've totally, nailed these behaviours, or I'm not seeing much of that. Tell me about it. Tell me about how you think you're demonstrating this behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spoke about this in a previous episode when we were talking about KPIs, the importance of building in behavioural based KPIs tied to your values into your KPIs and your performance reviews, because that's the real grit of what a business is and what a culture is. It's the behaviours.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. That's what drives it.
And I know it's harder to measure, it's harder to be clear about, but it's so worth it in terms of building that culture that you desire.
And it's harder, but it's not impossible. There's lots of ways to do it. And I think it does create such good conversation but even the conversations help engage people.
Absolutely. And the more you practice it and the more you get used to talking about it, the clearer it becomes for you as well as the leader.
Definitely. Yes, that's true too. Yeah. And what you're prepared to kind of tolerate and not.
Yes. Yeah. And just because you've tolerated something in the past doesn't mean you can't draw a line in the sand and say, I let that slide when I shouldn't have, or I wasn't clear about how damaging that was or how much that really didn't represent our culture, but I'm drawing a line in the sand right now. And
it's such a good moment for vulnerability, that, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. You can own the fact that you've let it slide and that you didn't pull them up, or that you've put up with things that were really you weren't happy with. But you just can draw the line in the sand. But once you've drawn that line, you've got to be prepared.
And I think this is the thing. And, we talk about how, the boss watching that goes on, that everybody's watching you as a leader to see how you deal with bad behavior, because that's the trickiest thing to deal with, isn't it?
Yes.
Underperformance is measured against things like KPIs or targets or goals or whatever. That's easier to measure and to talk about. But bad behaviour can be so tricky to talk about, I think.
Tricky to talk about, but more damaging to your business than poor performance ever will be.
Yes, and has such a big impact on people.
Yeah, and you're right, your team are watching. So if you're not dealing with it and they're seeing that, that's only eroding the trust that you built with them.
Absolutely. And they're going to think, well, if you're not going to deal with it, why would I bother dealing with it? But if they see you prepared to deal with it, then they're much more likely to have those conversations amongst themselves and not come to you, aren't they?
Yeah. And it motivates the team. When they see you deal with things like that, it builds trust straight away, and they want to be a better employee because you're being a better leader. Yes,
that's exactly right. We all want to be associated with something really positive, don't we?
Yes.
And that creates that sense for them.
Yeah.
I think it has so many benefits, and it's such a virtuous cycle, isn't it? When you do this, it creates so much goodness out of it at each level, I think.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations with the team pretty regularly, like at least once a year. But I would be touching base on this kind of thing quarterly or mid-year and just recapping and refocusing, are we still showing up like this? Is there a different way we can be, doing this, or have we let things slide here, and just recalibrate and get them back together.
I think that's so true. And even just asking that question, how are we demonstrating this? Can give me an example of how we did this or that in this team or that team. I think it's such a good conversation. And you're right, we so often forget to come back and have those conversations. They're such good ones to do.
And you'll see, if you only do it every year, what you'll see is you'll have this flurry of excitement and activity and commitment to it all for about 3 months. And it starts to wane after that. So you do need a little refocus. Otherwise, you're going to find you're going to get to the next years and think, well, we started all right, but how do we go beyond that?
Yeah. And again, as the leader, just demonstrating the fact that it's important to you and that you notice it keeps it sort of more to the front of people's minds.
Yeah. And I think exactly, acknowledging when you see it being done really well, just as much as you'd acknowledge someone, smashing a project out of the park, acknowledge when you see them really, dipping into that values-based behaviour.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm working with a client at the moment who does this by the CEO talking about a value each month on their internal sort of system, on their internal intranet. And he interviews somebody across the business about a value and how they're working with it and what they're doing.
I like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's just a great way to keep the values conversation top of mind for people.
Exactly, yes. And it sends a really clear signal that he thinks it's important too. That's so important, isn't it?
Yes, totally. And you see it in the reverse too, where those businesses like we spoke about at the beginning, where the values are all over the wall, but the CEO is showing zero interest and certainly not displaying any of those values themselves. What chance have you got for the team too?
Yeah, no, it's not going to be important to anyone.
No.
Oh, I love this conversation.
I know.
All sorts of directions.
Yeah, we could go really deep on some of this, but I think the important messages today are get clear on your values, because that's fundamental, and have the conversations with your team to get really clear about what behaviours you want to see and not see when it comes to every level of the business around those values. And that's what's going to create an amazing company culture.
I think so. And I think be clear about what behaviours you're prepared to demonstrate
Yeah.
and make sure you're out there doing that.
Yes.
Use
Oh, you've got to
role
lead by example. Yeah,
modeling.
definitely.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Lovely to talk, Christine.
As always, Juliet, thanks so much.
See you soon.